Hi, my name is Rod Kane, and today I want to talk to you about my favorite ancient medieval game, Triumph. I'm going to be a little bit different today because we're going to talk about another new product. So, if you're watching this video, you're probably familiar with the Triumph Ancient Medieval Battle Rules, which is a game that came out a few years back, 2019, in hard copy and a little bit earlier in the PDF version. And this game is for playing out historical battles with your favorite ancient medieval armies from history. So, what we wanted to do, and we've just come out with a new product to go with Triumph, which is the Fantasy Triumph. This is the early access release of Fantasy Triumph, and I want to explain a little bit about what is in Fantasy Triumph. So, the basic game that you have in Triumph with the 26 troop types and the mechanism for movement and combat is all the same. So we didn't make any changes. So what is Fantasy Triumph exactly? In the historical game, we have a system called battle cards. And battle cards are used to modify certain specific troops. So if you're familiar with the historical game, you'll be familiar with a battle card, for example, for taking no camp. So if you're a Mongol army, you don't want to have a camp, you take that battle card. There's cards for things like supporting bowmen. There's cards for dismounting knights, so certain knights have the ability to dismount. This is a historical based battle card. Fantasy Triumph is built off of a mechanism of battle cards and basically 5 new rule mechanisms. So to keep it simple, we didn't want to change the rules. There aren't a lot of new troop types. There are really no new troop types except for one that we'll talk about in a minute. But essentially you have all the standard troop types, all the standard rules from Triumph, but then you have more battle cards with which to modify your armies. So briefly what I want to do is cover kind of the 5 new rule mechanisms. So in Triumph, essentially the 5 new rule mechanisms are away, flight, heroes, which is sort of the new troop type that I'll talk about, magical range attacks, and dense topographies. So I'm going to kind of go through each one of those and explain them briefly in this video what they are. So first of all, I'm going to start with flying because flying is an easy one to explain. Flying is a new movement type. All right, so flying is I have a fantasy character that I want to give flight to. So for example, this Pteranodon or this dragon. So flying is a typical Fantasy Triumph battle card that you can buy for your unit. It's an ability. So it costs points. I pay the points. I add them to whatever my base troop type is. So as I mentioned, there's no new fighting or combat troop type. So for example, if I want to create a dragon with flying, I might start with a behemoth, which in Fantasy Triumph, that's just a fancy word for elephant. So I might start with the elephant troop type, which comes right out of Historical Triumph. So I take an elephant from Historical Triumph, I give the combat abilities to this unit, I put it on a similar basing, and then because it's got wings and I want it to fly, I add flying. Flying gives it certain capabilities for movement. There's 2 types of flying. There's zoom and hover. And zoom and hover is just a fancy way of saying one of them's fast and one of them's slow. So essentially troops that have hover flying don't have an increased movement, but they can go up in the air and fly, which allows them to do certain things on the battlefield that non-flying troops cannot do. It also makes them immune to combat if they don't want to against troops that can't shoot at them. So they get the ability to kind of fly over top of enemy troops. They can still be engaged in combat if they're caught on the ground, but flying gives them some special abilities and some vulnerabilities as well. So that's how you make something fly. You assign it the flying battle card out of the rules. With flying also comes another ability, which is the first rule I mentioned, called away. So if I have the ability to fly, I also have the ability potentially to fly so high up in the air that I'm effectively not in the battle anymore. I am away from the battle. So flying troops also have built into that battle card the ability to go away. And when they're away, they count against your army for casualties until they come back. So there's some inherent dangers to using the away card in that you're sending part of your forces off the table, which could cause your army to break sooner. So away is a feature that comes with flying, but away can be purchased by itself. And the way away works is when a unit goes away, it goes off table, and then it can reappear somewhere else on the table with certain restrictions on how close to an enemy, and also it takes a lot of command points to bring something from away. So away is a special feature that flying troops can have. And it can be purchased separate from flying. So for example, this particular creature here, it's a giant sand scorpion. And the way I play this one in my army, I assigned it the abilities of a cataphract. It's an armored, basically cavalry-like creature. I gave it terrain affinity for rough terrain because it's got a bunch of legs. So I kind of made it all terrain. That's another thing you can buy, terrain affinity, to allow things to go through rough terrain that would not normally go through rough terrain. But I also gave it away, which means that this scorpion can burrow into the ground and then reappear somewhere else. It can't fly, but it can go off battlefield, disappear from the battlefield, and reappear somewhere else. So that's an example of how you could create a totally different creature using a different combination of battle cards. Another classic example, Horde, Skeleton Horde. So for the Skeleton Horde, I based them as Horde. And then you can give them different features. So for example, I gave these Horde Unruly, which means they're harder to command, but they cost fewer points, so they're even cheaper than normal Horde. You can also give them Regenerate, so that you could spend command points to bring them back if they were destroyed. So you can have an endless regenerating section of Horde. Another example using the magical abilities. This is a War Wagon General that I use to command my Lizard army. War Wagon, because his minor spells shoot like range attacks in any direction. And then I give him a special ability called Spell Blast, which allows him to cast a big, powerful spell from his position with longer range and affect enemy troops. So when you get to the magical attacks, they're not quite like artillery. You might think of them as artillery, but they have a little bit different feature. The physical Spell Blast or magical Spell Blast could be negated by things like armored or by negate magic. But Spell Blast is a very powerful attack, but also a little bit random in that if you roll a 1, you can lose the ability to cast a spell. So it's a little bit different than an artillery shot. There's another magical attack called Mind Blast, which is in the same category. And Mind Blast doesn't destroy troops, but causes them to panic, flee from the battlefield, potentially dissipating if they don't have room to flee. So you can have a lot of fun recreating the types of spells. You can imagine what spell you want, but within those 3 categories of spells, you can create a fire breath weapon for a dragon. You can create a magical spell, or you could create the effects of terror or panic on troops from the magical spell or of a caster. So using those battle cards, you can build these different types of characteristics into the existing fantasy, existing troop types. So if I want to make a fantasy Pteranodon Lizard Riders, I take Horsebow, I give them flying. In this particular one, these guys have hover flying, so they're kind of slow. And then I also give them Fierce because they're lizards, so once they start winning, they don't want to back off. And Fierce means that they follow up in combat, just like the Knights would from the historical game. So this is an example of how you can build these features in there. There are a lot of battle cards to choose from for the fantasy characteristics, and that covers the first 3 of the different mechanics. The next one is heroes, and I want to talk a little bit about heroes. So what's a hero? For this, I shall use my larger scales. So if you want to put a hero on the battlefield in Fantasy Triumph, and of course, who doesn't when you're playing a fantasy battle, one of the ways to do that, this is my Trojan War size scale. These are quite large figures, but this is a battle taxi. So this particular battle taxi, for example, could be just a normal battle taxi, but in the case when we were playing the Battle of Troy, we actually had gods that would come down and influence the battle. And the way we represent a hero is they're not a combat stand. This is one individual. That individual doesn't represent a base going into combat, but you attach this individual to an existing combat stand by putting them next to or touching, and they have abilities that they can give to that stand. So, for example, in this particular case, I was playing Aphrodite, and I was giving her the battle card out of the book called Hearten. Now, I could give Hearten to the stand, but I can also give Hearten to a hero. That hero comes down, gives that ability to here, and Hearten happens to be an ability where if these guys lose by 1 in combat, they call it a draw. So you basically have to beat them by 2 in order to actually defeat them in combat. But because it's assigned to this hero during the movement phase of the battle could actually go and attach to a different stand. So, for example, I have a hero on this end of the battlefield. I need help on this end. I can move the hero to another spot in the battlefield and reintegrate them with a unit, giving that ability. This also could have been a wizard, or in this case, it could have been like Zeus. And Zeus might have a bolt of lightning, like the spell blast I mentioned from my Lord Croak over here. And if he is on the battlefield with this unit, from this point where he's attached, he could cast his bolt of lightning and affect somebody with a spell blast. So heroes are overly powerful individual characters that can affect the course of a battle, but they don't represent 5 to 10,000 troops that might be in a unit or a stand. So they are susceptible to disappearing if they're out on the battlefield by themselves and they are touched by an enemy stand. They would actually go away. So the heroes want to be with other stands. Other than that, the only way that heroes interact with any other object on the table besides giving their abilities to the friendly stands is they could actually start a duel. So there is a section here where if you've got multiple heroes on the battlefield, there actually could be a duel between the heroes where they get to call each other out, and the rules are covered here in the fantasy book. So we've got away as a new mechanism, flight, heroes, and we talked a little bit about the magical attacks, which are a way to create long-range spells on the battlefield. And then the last new rules or new mechanism is really just a terrain type, and it's called dense topography or dense terrain. So this one's kind of interesting because in the historical battle book, you'll notice that most of the battles between historical human armies, they usually take place in fairly open terrain. So when we tried to create the terrain cards that are in the back of the book, you'll see that when you generate the terrain, armies, especially in the ancient medieval world, they didn't line up typically in a dense forest to fight because most of them weren't very effective fighting in that way. So most of the historical battles are designed to be generated in that random terrain, but with an open field for the armies to deploy and fight. The dense topography is for when you're trying to create a random fantasy battle. One of the things you could take with your army, let's say you had a bunch of lizards, for example, you could take a dense swampy topography. Or if you had sylvan elves, you could take a dense forest topography. And the dense topography means that instead of the majority of the battlefield being open terrain with some rough terrain features, the majority of the battlefield will start as a default rough terrain of the type that you've chosen. And there will be open sections in it based on the randomization of the cards. So, for example, the card is the inverse. Those dots on the card with the numbers, you can still use those same terrain cards, but you'll be placing open terrain in the rough areas. And then all dense topographies have at least one column down the middle of somewhat open terrain so that other armies that you're facing have at least some place to deploy. Now, this was designed for the fantasy games. They talks about the different types of things that you can imagine these would represent in the back of the book, or in the back of the fantasy book. But it's also interesting for historical. So, for example, you can create scenarios in historical games like Teutoburg Forest, and the Teutoburg Forest would be essentially dense terrain, an open column in the center, Romans deployed along that open column, German tribes coming out of the woods. So there's a way to use that to create some historical battles as well. But it's really designed for creating the fantasy realms that might be a little bit extreme in comparison to a normal historical human army battle. So that's the mechanism. That's the only new mechanisms in the game. The rest of the book are the battle cards. So the key to this fantasy book is that it has a bunch of different cards, and here's a quick reference of them in the back, that allow you to modify both your army and your troop stands to create almost any fantasy army that you can imagine. And they also, some of the cards will affect the army, and some of the cards will affect the stand. I think you'll find that everything in there in a sandbox format that you need to create almost any army you can imagine out of your favorite literature, your favorite TV or movie, your favorite mythological story. Another thing is there's also some sections in the book that will cover examples of how to create a hero, from fiction, or how to create a particular fantasy army type like high elves, sylvan elves, orcs. It just suggestions, of course. With Fantasy Triumph, there are no army lists. The army lists are whatever your imagination can create within these rules, purchasing your battle cards, assigning them to your troop types, and then generating an army. One interesting thing that's a little bit different in Fantasy too is in historical, for example, I use this Hector as my general for my Trojan army, and I gave him for free. We normally make the generals for free, slightly better than normal troops. So as a battle taxi, as a general, I give him +1 to combat for both mounted and foot, which is deadly. So that's actually a battle card you can buy separately in this in the fantasy extension. So he's a deadly battle taxi. And then I also gave him armored, and armored means that he is, for half a point, he is going to be less subjective to missile fire. So as you know, in the historical game, generals, when you're shooting at them, you get a -1 to your shot. So armored and deadly, and this is just a battle taxi general. So that is pointed out and paid for. In the Fantasy Triumph, if you want to get a 48-point army with the general's ability available to purchase, it's 51 points. So to give you an example, deadly's a 2-point cost, and then half a point for armored. So you're basically playing with a 51-point cost army. So another interesting thing is, because those are separate abilities, when I play with Achilles, I gave him deadly, but he doesn't get armored because he's susceptible to getting shot in the heel by Paris, for example. So with the battle card rules, you can go in and customize and tweak. So I can create a subtle difference between Achilles and Hector. I played them as actual battle taxis, but you could also take Achilles, and you could have made Achilles a hero instead of an actual stand. And you could have said, okay, well, Achilles now has certain features like deadly assigned to him, and if he's attached to the Myrmidons, and the Myrmidons, I played those as elite foot. When Achilles is with the Myrmidons, they become deadly elite foot, so they get to be a +6, +4 instead of their usual +5, +3 when they're fighting. So this is a way that you can take your favorite mythology, your favorite fiction, your favorite movie, or your favorite comic book, and turn it into a tabletop battlefield with large armies, play out a fantasy game of Triumph, and have a lot of fun with it. So we hope you'll take this book and take a look at it. It's been out getting play tested by the Triumph Centurions for a couple years now. We've been playing it ourselves. We just recently did an 8-person show up with your army created from these rules fantasy tournament. Had a lot of fun with it at Historicon. We played the Trojan War on the floor using some of the heroes, using the gods as heroes, and also had a lot of fun with it. It's a sandbox. Use your imagination. There are no limits to what you can do with the armies, so you can create whatever your imagination allows you to create, and you can play it on the table. You can also bring a perfectly normal historical army right out of the listing from Meshwash and play it straight up against fantasy, and you'll find that it'll give the fantasy army a run for its money because of the point system. So, once again, this is Fantasy Triumph Early Access. It's available as a PDF, download on Wargame Vault, and like all of our Early Access products, if you pick up this one, you are entitled to get any updates that come along for free, including the final version of it, whatever format that takes, with fancy pictures and hopefully some more nice artwork as well. So, my name's Rod Kane. The game's called Triumph. Thanks for watching, and I hope you take a look at that Fantasy Triumph game and give us some feedback on the forum or on the Facebook page. Thanks.